In the United States, the idea of ordinary people has always been linked to an unspoken promise. Hard work leads to stability, but in recent years, that promise has begun to falter. The cost of living has risen faster than wages. Once secure jobs have disappeared, and millions of people have found themselves living with the constant feeling of running on a treadmill that never leads anywhere. It is in this scenario that it emerges Ethan Miller, a 38-year-old man from Columbus, Ohio, married and father of a 7-year-old girl. He didn't consider himself a failure, but he didn't feel like a winner either. He had worked for 12 years as a supervisor at a distribution center. His salary paid the bills, but there was never anything left over. Whenever something unexpected happened, a car repair, a medical expense, a rent increase, the fragile balance broke. Ethan didn't dream of getting rich. What he wanted was simple: to stop feeling afraid every time his cell phone vibrated with a bank notification. On the other side of this story, unaware that their decisions would affect thousands of people, was Lucas Grant. Unlike Ethan, Lucas didn't come from a life of hardship. A former employee of a large California technology company, he had participated in the initial development of artificial intelligence tools used by millions today. When he left the company, it wasn't for lack of money, but out of frustration. He perceived something that almost no one openly discussed. AI wasn't just replacing jobs, it was creating unseen opportunities for those who knew how to use it before most people. Lucas saw a growing chasm between those who understood technology and those who merely consumed it without comprehension. And this chasm, for him, was more dangerous than any economic crisis. While Ethan dealt with shelves, targets, and extra shifts, artificial intelligence was already a passive part of his daily life. The algorithm decided which videos he watched, which ads appeared, and which news reached him. AI was already influencing his life, but he wasn't gaining anything from it. The conflict begins precisely there. On a typical Tuesday night, after putting his daughter to bed, Ethan sat on the sofa with his laptop open, not to study or start a business, but to look for ways to cut expenses. The idea of making money online had always seemed vague, almost deceptive. Exaggerated promises, videos with rented luxury cars, speeches that didn't connect with his reality. But something different appeared that night. A simple video, without flashy editing, recorded in a small office. No ostentatious setting. Just a man calmly explaining how people without technical experience were using artificial intelligence to create real sources of extra income, working a few hours a day from home. Ethan almost closed the video in the first few seconds. Skepticism was automatic, but something made him continue. The man wasn't promising quick money. He was talking about learning, adapting, and strategically using tools that already existed, tools that most people ignored or underestimated. Meanwhile, Lucas Grant observed something curious on the other side of the screen. The comments. They weren't from investors, nor from programmers. They were from teachers, drivers, tired freelancers, working mothers, retirees trying to supplement their income, ordinary people. Doubt hung in the air like an invisible weight. If it was so accessible, why did so few people talk about it openly? Ethan closed his laptop that night without making any decision. But something had been planted. For the first time in years, he felt not only fear of the future, he felt curiosity. And curiosity, in that context, was dangerous, because curiosity leads to action, and action changes trajectories. The antagonist in this story wasn't a specific person. It was an entire system based on dependence on a single salary, a lack of time to learn something new, and the constant fear of trying and failing. Artificial intelligence emerged as a neutral tool, but its use, or lack thereof, separated those who remained trapped from those who discovered new possibilities. At that initial moment, Ethan didn't yet know it, but his life was about to be divided into two very clear phases, before and after, understanding how AI could work for him and not just observe him from afar. The mystery that was forming wasn't whether it was possible to make money with artificial intelligence. It was why so many people weren't doing it yet, and what would happen when this information ceased to be invisible. In the United States, official discourse always extolled innovation and progress, but the daily reality for a large part of the population was far less futuristic. In neighborhoods like Ethan's, the houses were aligned, the lawns trimmed, and the cars too similar to each other. The appearance conveyed stability, but behind the closed doors there was a silent tension, accumulated bills, maxed-out credit cards, and the feeling that any mistake could cause financial collapse. Ethan was part of that invisible majority. His day began at 5 in the morning, before sunrise. The journey to the distribution center was automatic, almost mechanical. He knew every traffic light, every pothole in the road. At work, he coordinated teams, solved logistical problems, and dealt with increasingly aggressive targets. The company called this optimization. For him, it was just more responsibility without a proportional increase in salary. The corporate environment had changed in recent years. Automated systems began to decide schedules, productivity, and even warnings. Artificial intelligence was already there, silently observing and evaluating, but no one explained how it worked or how it could benefit those outside the executive offices. Ethan felt that something was being decided above him, and without him. At home, the family dynamic reinforced this pressure. His wife, Laura, worked part-time as an administrative assistant. Intelligent and organized, she frequently suggested they look for new sources of income. Not out of ambition, but out of necessity. Conversations about money happened in hushed tones, almost always at night, when their daughter was already asleep. There were no explosive arguments, just a shared exhaustion. On the other side of the country, Lucas Grant lived an opposite, but equally unsettling reality. Living in a mid-sized California city, far from the glamour of San Francisco, he had distanced himself from the heart of the big tech companies. His office was at home, simple, with a powerful computer, a clean desk, and few distractions. He wasn't a typical influencer or someone seeking fame. What drove him was the frustration of seeing a powerful technology being monopolized by a few. Lucas believed that artificial intelligence was not an end in itself, but a lever. In his hands, it had accelerated tasks, reduced costs, and created digital products in days, not months. What impressed him most was not the complexity of AI, but how much it eliminated barriers for people without advanced technical training. Analyzing market data, Lucas noticed a clear pattern. Freelancers using AI to produce content faster, small entrepreneurs automating customer service, ordinary people creating simple and profitable digital products without teams or large investments. None of this appeared in traditional news outlets. It was a silent movement. He began documenting these cases, initially for himself. Real stories, modest numbers, replicable processes. The more he studied, the more evident it became that the true differentiator wasn't the technology, but the mindset. Most people saw AI as a threat. Few saw it as a tool. Ethan, unknowingly, was part of that second potential group. After watching a few more videos and reading comments, he began to notice subtle changes around him. Co-workers were talking about online gigs, but always vaguely. One of them mentioned using AI tools to create product descriptions and sell simple services on digital platforms. It wasn't anything grand, but it paid the rent. These small pieces of information began to connect. Ethan started to realize that a parallel ecosystem existed, operating on the fringes of traditional employment. People who hadn't quit their jobs, but had created a second source of income, discrete, scalable, and most importantly, under their own control. American entrepreneurial culture has always celebrated grand success stories, billion-dollar startups, and extraordinary journeys. What no one talked about were the stories of quiet extra income streams that didn't make headlines but changed lives. Lucas understood this deeply. That's why, when he started sharing content, he avoided grandiose terms. He talked about simple processes, identifying problems, using AI to create quick solutions, and testing them in the real market. The secondary characters in this story emerge at this point. Ordinary people who cross Ethan's path indirectly. A teacher who sells AI-generated lesson plans, a driver who created automated scripts for small local businesses, a mother who organized personalized e-books. None of them were technology experts. They all learned by doing. The antagonism was taking on a clearer form. It wasn't a company nor a classic villain. It was misinformation, the fear of trying something new, and the dominant narrative that advanced technology is exclusive to geniuses or millionaires. This belief kept people trapped in exhausting routines, even when accessible tools were just a click away. Ethan was beginning to change. Albeit slowly. He didn't quit his job or announce any grand plans. He simply started studying discreetly at night. He observed, tested, and made mistakes. Artificial intelligence was ceasing to be a distant concept and becoming something practical, almost domestic. Lucas, in turn, refined his mission. He knew that if he didn't clearly explain the how, everything would be lost in yet another empty internet promise. His focus was on building bridges between technology and everyday reality, translating complex possibilities into simple actions. The world of the story expanded, showing that what was at stake was not just extra money, but autonomy. The ability to decide how long to work, where to invest energy, and how to use technology to one's advantage, and not as a threat. And at that point in the narrative, it became clear something was quietly stirring in the United States. A transformation that didn't begin in large corporations, but in ordinary homes after the children went to sleep and fear gave way to curiosity. Ethan's foray into this new universe wasn't met with immediate excitement. On the contrary, the more he learned, the more obstacles arose, testing his willingness to continue. The promise of extra income with artificial intelligence seemed real, but the path to it was far from simple. The first conflict arose with time, or rather, with the lack of it. Between extended work shifts, family responsibilities, and accumulated fatigue, studying something new required concrete sacrifices. Ethan began sleeping less, waking up earlier, and using small breaks during the day to test tools. There was no glamour in this process. There was frustration, mistakes, and the constant feeling of always being one step behind. Meanwhile, the environment around him seemed to resist change. Co-workers reacted with irony when he mentioned artificial intelligence outside of a corporate context. For many, AI was synonymous with layoffs, surveillance, and control. The idea of using it as an ally sounded almost naive. This collective skepticism created an invisible weight, making Ethan question whether he wasn't wasting energy on something uncertain. From Lucas Grant's perspective, the conflict took on a different form. As his content began to reach more people, a reaction opposite to curiosity arose. Distrust. Some accused him of oversimplifying, others of hiding the real secret. Lucas realized that the internet was saturated with empty promises, and this tainted any honest attempt at teaching. To combat this, he began to show complete processes from beginning to end. No miraculous results, just clear steps. Identify real demands, use AI to accelerate production, and validate solutions in the market. Even so, many gave up too quickly. The biggest enemy wasn't the technology, but the unrealistic expectations created by years of aggressive marketing. Ethan experienced this shock firsthand when he attempted his first project. Using AI, he created a small digital service aimed at local businesses, something simple, functional, and quick to deliver. The theory made sense, the execution not so much. Initial contacts were ignored. Some responded with distrust. Others asked for such low prices that they barely covered the effort. This was the moment when the internal conflict intensified. Ethan began to question whether it was really worth it. The money still wasn't coming in. The effort was real, and the fear of failure was growing. He didn't want to give up, but he also couldn't afford to insist indefinitely on something that wasn't working. External pressure increased when Laura realized she was exhausted. She wasn't against the idea, but she needed to see concrete signs. It wasn't enough to learn something new. Reality demanded results. This domestic tension didn't manifest itself in open discussions, but in prolonged silences and worried glances. The risk wasn't just financial, but emotional. Lucas, for his part, faced a strategic dilemma. The more people he attracted, the more he needed to filter expectations. He knew that not everyone would have immediate success, and this put him in a delicate position. Teaching meant taking responsibility for the frustrations of others. Still, he continued, because the success stories began to multiply, these cases formed an invisible network. People who didn't know each other but shared a pattern. They started small, adjusted quickly, and used AI as an effort multiplier, not as a replacement for work. Ethan began to observe this pattern more closely. He realized he had made a common mistake. He tried to create something before deeply understanding the problem he was solving. This insight changed his approach. Instead of trying to sell quickly, he began to observe more closely. He analyzed local businesses, their pain points, their time and budget constraints. He used AI to simulate solutions, test approaches, and adjust proposals. Conflict ceased to be merely external and became strategic. Still, new obstacles arose. Online platforms changed the rules. Competitors emerged offering lower prices, and the feeling of instability was constant. Unlike traditional employment, there were no guarantees. Every small advance came with new risks. The antagonism became more concrete. The scarcity mindset, reinforced by years of dependence on a single salary. Ethan struggled with the idea that extra effort should generate immediate returns. Lucas, in turn, fought against the belief that success with technology required genius or large investments. The secondary characters also added layers to the conflict. Some gave up halfway through, reinforcing doubts. Others progressed slowly, showing that progress was possible, but uneven. These stories crossed Ethan's path like contradictory signs, both warnings and hope. At the heart of it all was an uncomfortable truth. Artificial intelligence didn't eliminate work, but it eliminated excuses. It made visible who was willing to learn, test, and adapt. This direct confrontation with discipline itself was uncomfortable. By the end of this stage, Ethan had not yet achieved financial stability with AI. But something had changed irreversibly. He no longer felt completely held hostage by the traditional system. Even without significant results, he had acquired something rare: the awareness that alternative paths existed and that they were accessible, although they required real persistence. The conflict now was no longer about whether it was possible to make money with artificial intelligence. It was about whether he was willing to persevere through the most difficult part of the process, the part where almost no one is watching and the results haven't yet appeared. As Ethan progressed, the story ceased to be solely about him. Other paths began to intersect, creating subplots that broadened the complexity of the main conflict without diverting it. Each one revealed a different facet of the same phenomenon: ordinary people trying to adapt to a world where artificial intelligence was advancing faster than collective understanding. One of these subplots unfolded within Ethan's own work environment. The company announced the implementation of a new automated demand forecasting system, reducing the need for human supervision across multiple shifts. Although no one said it openly, the message was clear: fewer people would be needed in the near future. The news spread like a constant buzz, fueling insecurity and rumors. Some colleagues reacted with resignation, others with outrage. A small group began to look for alternatives, but without a clear direction. Ethan observed everything with a mixture of concern and lucidity. For the first time, he didn't feel completely helpless. AI, which for many was an abstract threat, was beginning to become a concrete tool for him, still imperfect but real. Another subplot unfolded within the family. Laura, initially only cautious, became more involved when she noticed subtle changes in Ethan's behavior. He was more attentive, more strategic. He didn't talk about easy money, but about processes. She began to help him, reviewing texts, organizing ideas, testing simple approaches. Without realizing it, the two were building a small partnership. This involvement brought a new emotional complexity. Success, even small success, was no longer just an individual matter. Each failed attempt affected them both. Every advance, however small, brought collective relief. The risk was now shared, which increased both the pressure and the commitment. Meanwhile, Lucas Grant was grappling with his own web of subplots. Some of his informal students began achieving consistent results and decided to create closed communities, offering paid access to advanced content. Lucas viewed this with ambivalence. On the one hand, it proved the model worked. On the other, he feared that information would once again become inaccessible to those who needed it most. He began to question his role. Teaching for free had its limits. Scaling required structure. Structure required resources. The risk was becoming exactly the kind of figure he criticized, someone detached from the reality of ordinary people. This dilemma shaped his decisions and influenced how he communicated his ideas. Another subplot emerged from people who misinterpreted the use of artificial intelligence. Some tried to automate everything, eliminating any human effort. Others copied models without understanding the context. These errors generated frustration, cancellations, and negative reports, which spread rapidly across forums and social media. These stories reached Ethan as indirect warnings. He realized that it wasn't enough to use AI. It needed to be used judiciously. Tools didn't replace market understanding, empathy with customers, or adaptability. This awareness made him advance more slowly, but in a more solid way. The time pressure was starting to intensify. The implied deadline wasn't a calendar, but a financial reality. Expenses didn't wait for learning. The system didn't pause for career transitions. Ethan knew he needed results before an unexpected change, a layoff, an emergency, made everything untenable. At this point, a crucial subplot unfolds when Ethan meets a small group of people in a similar situation online. They didn't call themselves mentors or gurus. They were simply individuals sharing processes, mistakes, and adjustments. This exchange created a rare sense of belonging. No one promised quick success, only measurable progress. These interactions brought new perspectives. One showed how he used AI to create simple, recurring digital products. Another explained how he validated ideas before investing too much time. Each account added a practical layer to Ethan's journey, reducing the feeling of isolation. The antagonism was now fragmented into various forms: collective fear at work, financial pressure at home, confusion caused by bad news, and the constant temptation to give up in the face of slow results. All of this coexisted, making the journey denser and more realistic. Lucas followed these stories from a distance, analyzing patterns. He realized that those who progressed had something in common. They treated AI as a means, not as a miracle. This observation reinforced his conviction that the real difference lay in disciplined execution, not in the tool itself. At the end of this phase, the subplots began to align. Nothing was resolved, but everything pointed to a moment of decision. The pressures were mounting. Time seemed to be running out, and the margin for error was shrinking. The story was approaching a point where small choices would have big consequences. Ethan was still an ordinary man, with an ordinary life. But now he was immersed in a system of possibilities that demanded practical courage, not motivational speeches. The next step wouldn't just be to learn more, it would be to act more boldly, taking calculated risks. The turning point didn't come with a big announcement or a significant financial gain. It emerged quietly, almost unnoticed, but with a profound and irreversible impact on Ethan's life. It all started on an ordinary Friday when the distribution center faced a failure in its new automated system. The algorithm, which promised maximum efficiency, generated a chain reaction of errors, delayed shipments, miscalculated routes, and disorganized shifts. Supervisors were urgently called in to contain the chaos. Ethan spent hours solving problems that, ironically, had been created by the very technology that was supposed to replace it. At the end of his shift, exhausted, he realized something that would change his perspective on the situation. Artificial intelligence did not eliminate human need. It shifted value. Those who knew how to interpret, adjust, or direct it became essential. Those who merely obeyed automated decisions became disposable. This realization gained strength that same night when Ethan received an unexpected response to a proposal he had sent weeks earlier. A small local accounting firm, tired of wasting time on repetitive tasks, agreed to test the service he had developed with AI support. It wasn't a large contract. The amount was modest, but there was something different, a monthly recurring payment. Ethan read the email several times, not out of euphoria, but out of disbelief. For the first time, someone was willing to pay continuously for something he had created outside of his traditional job. This wasn't a side hustle. It was a system, still small but functional. The emotional impact was immediate, though restrained. He didn't celebrate aloud. He simply took a deep breath and began to work. He implemented the solution, adjusted details, answered questions. He used artificial intelligence not to replace human contact, but to gain speed, clarity, and consistency. Meanwhile, Lucas Grant was experiencing his own turning point. An informal report, compiling stories from students and followers, revealed something he suspected but hadn't yet confirmed. Most of the people who were getting results weren't following trends or popular models. They were creating specific solutions for specific, often local problems, using AI as silent support. Lucas decided to radically change his approach. Instead of talking about what AI can do, he started showing how ordinary people are using AI right now. Real-world cases, real-world values, simple processes. This change alienated part of the audience, but strengthened another, smaller, but much more engaged. The real turning point for Ethan came a few weeks later when the accounting firm requested a further adjustment to the service. Nothing complex. A simple tweak that, without AI, would have taken days. With the right tools, it took hours. The client immediately recognized the value and recommended the service to another contact. This nomination changed everything, not for the money itself, but for the external validation. What was once an uncertain gamble was becoming something replicable. Ethan was no longer testing an idea, he was operating a model, small, imperfect, but real. At home, Laura noticed the change even before seeing the numbers. Ethan's tiredness was now accompanied by focus, not frustration. He spoke less, but acted more. When he showed her the first recurring payment, there was no exaggerated celebration. There was silence, a silence heavy with relief. This moment marked a clear reversal in the story's dynamic. Fear ceased to be the main driving force. In its place arose responsibility. Now Ethan needed to decide how far he would go, keep it as a safe extra income, or scale it up, taking on new risks. The antagonism was also transforming. Before, it was ignorance and fear. Now, it was the temptation to remain small, in order not to fail. Growing required exposure, organization, and, above all, accepting that the path without guarantees had already begun. Lucas observed this pattern repeating itself in several stories. The turning point was never the first big win, but the first recurring win. That's where the mindset changed. People stopped chasing quick money and started building simple and sustainable systems. For Ethan, the most unexpected revelation came when analyzing his own results. Artificial intelligence wasn't the main differentiator. It only reduced the cost of error. It allowed for rapid testing, adjustment, and delivery of value. The real gain lay in the ability to observe real problems and act. The final event that sealed the turning point happened at work. A manager casually mentioned that further cutbacks were being considered for the next quarter. For the first time, Ethan heard the news without panicking. He wasn't ready to leave, but he wasn't trapped either. The story took a turn at that moment. The focus shifted from survival to strategy. The question was no longer if AI could generate income, but how to structure it in an intelligent and sustainable way. Nothing was resolved. The risk still existed, but the trajectory now pointed forward, not toward an endless cycle of trial and error. The turning point hadn't made Ethan special, just aware. And this awareness was innovative, surprising, and above all, replicable. The turning point brought no rest. It brought consequences, and they began to appear almost immediately, testing whether Ethan's change of course was solid or just a stroke of luck. The first consequence was internal. The psychological security that previously came from a fixed salary was now shared with a new, still fragile source of income. This altered the way Ethan made decisions. He began to observe traditional work with more detachment, noticing structural flaws that he had previously accepted as immutable. Each unproductive meeting, each goal imposed by algorithms, reinforced the feeling that his time was worth more than he had imagined. This change in attitude did not go unnoticed. Supervisors noticed that Ethan was asking more questions, suggesting adjustments, and pointing out inconsistencies in the automated systems. Although his observations were correct, the environment did not reward this type of initiative. The company valued operational obedience, not critical thinking. This friction created a new kind of tension. Ethan needed to keep his job while quietly building something outside of it. At home, the reactions were equally complex. Laura felt relief, but also caution. The extra money helped, but the real impact was on her emotional state. The constant anxiety had lessened, but it was replaced by a new concern: growth. The further the project progressed, the more time it demanded. The risk now was not only financial, but also of burnout. They needed to renegotiate routines, schedules, responsibilities, expectations. The extra income ceased to be an individual experiment and became a family decision. This brought maturity to the relationship, but also required difficult conversations about boundaries, priorities, and medium-term plans. From Lucas Grant's perspective, the consequences were evident on a larger scale. His more realistic content attracted fewer people, but those who did were better prepared. The messages he received changed in tone. Instead of generic questions, there were detailed accounts of ongoing processes, specific doubts, and strategic adjustments. Lucas realized he had created something different, not a passive audience, but a functional community. However, this also brought responsibility. Every misinterpreted guideline could cause real harm. Lucas became more careful, emphasizing risks, limitations, and the importance of local adaptation. This stance contradicted the logic of the Internet's rapid growth, but it strengthened credibility. For Ethan, the practical consequences began when new clients emerged. Referrals generated different demands, requiring personalization. Artificial intelligence accelerated the work, but did not eliminate decisions. Each client brought a unique context, and mistakes now had a direct impact on the service's reputation. A poorly executed adjustment almost cost a contract. The correction was swift, but the warning was clear. Growing without structure could destroy everything. This experience reinforced the need for minimal processes, even in small operations. Ethan began documenting steps, creating checklists, and using AI to maintain consistency, not just speed. External reactions also intensified. Some co-workers began asking questions, curiosity mixed with disbelief. Ethan neither preached nor hid anything. He answered simply, explaining that there was no secret, just the strategic use of accessible tools. Some were interested, others dismissed the idea as too risky. This division highlighted a larger pattern. The same information generated opposite reactions depending on the mindset. For some, it was an opportunity. For others, a threat. The antagonism of the story revealed itself more clearly as resistance to change, not a lack of resources. Lucas observed this on a larger scale. As more stories emerged, it became clear that AI didn't automatically democratize income. It amplified existing behaviors. Disciplined people gained leverage. Disorganized people accumulated frustration. This realization shaped his narrative and reinforced the importance of realistic expectations. The psychological impact on Ethan was profound. He stopped seeing himself merely as an employee. He began to see himself as someone capable of creating value outside of rigid structures. This didn't make him invulnerable, but it made him less dependent. This change was reflected in small actions, firmer negotiations, strategic refusals, conscious choices about where to invest his time. The consequences also included losses. Ethan stopped accepting overtime that he previously considered mandatory. This temporarily reduced his fixed income, but freed up time for the project. The decision was uncomfortable, but necessary. The balance between security and growth became a constant game. By the end of this phase, the reactions were clear. Earning extra income with AI wasn't a shortcut, but a reconfiguration of priorities. It demanded responsibility, continuous learning, and a willingness to deal with uncertainty. In return, it offered something rare, progressive control over one's own time and effort. Nothing had fully stabilized, but the initial chaos had given way to a more conscious movement. Ethan was no longer reacting to the system, he was building something parallel to it. And that changed everything. The growth phase didn't begin with rapid expansion, but with difficult choices. Ethan soon realized that continuing to move forward would require more than repeating what already worked. The newfound comfort was tempting, but insufficient to sustain the future that was beginning to take shape. The challenge now lay not in learning something new, but in abandoning old habits. The first challenge was structural. Until then, Ethan had worked reactively, responding to demands as they arose. This worked on a small scale, but it was beginning to create bottlenecks. Different clients, simultaneous requests, overlapping deadlines. The feeling of control threatened to disappear. Instead of backtracking, he decided to confront the problem head-on. Using its own artificial intelligence, it created clearer workflows. It automated repetitive steps, standardized deliverables, and began saying no to requests that fell outside the scope. This change was uncomfortable. Denying opportunities seemed to contradict the logic of growth, but in practice, it brought clarity and efficiency. Overcoming this challenge also required personal growth. Ethan had to develop skills he had never needed before: negotiation, pricing, and clear communication. He didn't become an expert overnight. He made mistakes in pricing, underestimated deadlines, and had to correct agreements. Each mistake cost him energy, but it also brought concrete learning. At home, this growth was visible. Laura noticed that Ethan was no longer just talking about tasks, but about strategic decisions. He was thinking in the medium term, assessing risks and planning scenarios. The extra income was no longer just a supplement and was beginning to present itself as a real, albeit partial, alternative to the traditional model. The new challenge was emotional. With growth came the opposite fear, the fear of losing everything he had built. Before, the risk was having nothing. Now, it was losing something that worked. This tension demanded maturity. Ethan needed to learn to separate results from identity, preventing each fluctuation from defining his personal worth. Lucas Grant observed this stage with particular attention. It was there that most people stagnated. Initial growth gave way to responsibilities, and many retreated. For Lucas, true breakthrough began when someone understood that AI didn't replace difficult decisions, it only made those decisions inevitable sooner. Lucas began to emphasize this point in his content. He spoke less about tools and more about mental processes, about how to create simple systems, protect time, and avoid the trap of overload. His discourse matured along with his audience, reflecting collective evolution. For Ethan, a new test arose when a larger client showed interest. The value was significant, but the scope required intense dedication for several weeks. Accepting meant committing nights and weekends. Refusing meant giving up an important opportunity. The decision was not immediate. He analyzed the project, simulated scenarios with AI support, calculated the financial impact and personal strain. For the first time, he made a decision based on data and clear limits. He accepted the contract, but renegotiated deadlines and deliverables. The client agreed. This simple adjustment was a silent milestone of growth. The execution was intense, but organized. Ethan no longer improvised. Each step had a purpose. AI functioned as constant support, reducing rework and allowing focus on what really mattered. The project was delivered with quality, on time, and generated new referrals. Growth was also evident in how Ethan approached traditional work. He didn't despise it, but he stopped seeing it as the only option. This change in attitude brought confidence, not arrogance. He began to choose where to invest his energy, not just react to external demands. The challenges, however, did not disappear. The accumulated fatigue took its toll. There were weeks when balance was almost lost. Ethan needed to adjust his pace, lower his expectations, and accept that sustainable growth is not linear. This awareness prevented relapses into patterns of exhaustion. By the end of this phase, the achievement was clear. Ethan hadn't become someone extraordinary. He remained an ordinary person with real limitations. What had changed was his relationship with effort, time, and technology. He no longer sought shortcuts. He built leverage. Growth wasn't just about income, but about progressive autonomy. It was about the ability to choose, adjust, and evolve without depending exclusively on external structures. Artificial intelligence was no longer a novelty. It was an integrated, almost invisible tool. The story was moving into a new stage. The focus was shifting from proving that it was possible to make money with AI. Now it was about consolidating, protecting, and preparing the ground for something bigger. And that would require one last tense phase before the outcome. The lead-up to the climax wasn't marked by major, isolated events, but by a sequence of strategic decisions that together created a growing sense of inevitability. Ethan felt he was approaching a point where it would no longer be possible to keep everything exactly as it was. Something would have to change, not impulsively, but out of necessity. The first clear sign came from the side project itself. Demand was starting to become predictable. It was no longer a random sequence of clients, but a steady, still small, but stable flow. This predictability brought a new responsibility: planning. Ethan realized that improvising was no longer acceptable. Every choice would now have a cumulative impact. he began reviewing all the open subplots in his life. The smaller clients who demanded a lot of time and returned little were gradually closed. There were no dramatic breakups, just conscious closures. This clearing reduced the mental load and freed up space to focus on what truly sustained growth. Artificial intelligence began to be used more strategically, not just to perform tasks, but to simulate scenarios. Ethan tested prices, deadlines, and volumes. He observed how small changes affected the whole. This gave him a vision that previously seemed exclusive to large companies. Now, he could make decisions based on real projections, not just intuition. In the traditional workplace, tension was rising. Rumors of restructuring were becoming more concrete. Closed meetings, leadership changes, and vague announcements created an atmosphere of instability. Many colleagues reacted with anxiety. Ethan, though attentive, did not share the same panic. He knew that an external event could accelerate decisions that were already maturing internally. At home, the preparation took on a practical tone. Ethan and Laura began to organize their finances more rigorously. They created a specific reserve to support a transition period, should it be necessary. It wasn't about quitting their jobs, but about reducing the fear associated with that possibility. Each month of savings built a little more psychological freedom. Laura also took on a more active role. She began organizing contacts, tracking payments, and helping to structure simple processes. This collaboration not only optimized the project, but also strengthened mutual trust. The extra income ceased to be an individual endeavor and became a shared plan. Meanwhile, Lucas Grant felt his own journey was approaching a turning point. The number of consistent stories was growing, and a clear pattern was emerging. Ordinary people were quietly, sustainably, and out of the spotlight, generating extra income with AI. The problem was that this narrative had not yet been organized in a clear and accessible way for the wider audience. Lucas began to structure everything he had observed, not as a traditional course, but as a practical roadmap. Simple steps, real examples, common mistakes. He knew that if he failed to communicate this correctly, the knowledge would be lost amidst exaggerated promises and misinformation. This preparation created a parallel tension. Both Ethan and Lucas were moving toward decisions that could not be postponed indefinitely. For Ethan, the question was how long to maintain the balance between two worlds. For Lucas, it was how to reveal something without distorting it. The pace of the narrative accelerated. Small events gained weight. A late client, a particularly demanding week at work, a seemingly simple financial decision. Everything contributed to a feeling of temporal compression. The time to adjust, make mistakes, and backtrack diminished. Ethan felt it physically. The exhaustion came not only from the workload, but from the constant attention. He was always evaluating, comparing, deciding. To avoid a breakdown, he needed to establish clear boundaries. He reduced his hours, delegated small tasks, and accepted that growth didn't mean doing everything alone. Preparing for the climax also involved confronting old fears, the fear of failing publicly, the fear of disappointing his family, the fear of discovering that it all had too low a ceiling. Instead of ignoring them, Ethan began to treat them as data, risks to be considered, not absolute truths. Lucas, in turn, began receiving invitations for larger partnerships and exhibitions. Some offered quick visibility, but demanded excessive simplification of the message. He refused most. He knew that the climax of the story could not be built on exaggeration. It needed to be true to the reality of ordinary people. The subplots began to resolve themselves. The online support group became less active as each member found their own path. Some moved forward, others stopped. There was no resentment, just natural cycles coming to an end. These resolutions freed up narrative energy for the final confrontation. By the end of this phase, everything was aligned. The foundations were laid, the risks mapped, the decisions carefully considered. The next step would no longer be preparatory. It would be definitive. The climax was approaching not as a sudden explosion, but as the inevitable convergence of choices accumulated over time. And when he arrived, there would be no going back to the starting point. The climax didn't arrive with a dramatic announcement or an impulsive decision. It was formed from a sequence of events that individually would seem ordinary, but together made it impossible to continue exactly as before. It all began on a Monday morning when Ethan was called to an unexpected meeting. There was no fanfare, no explicit crisis atmosphere, just an objective conversation about operational reorganization. The discourse was neutral, almost technical. Functions would be redistributed. Some positions would cease to exist. Others would be absorbed by more advanced automated systems. Ethan's name wasn't on the immediate list. But the message was clear. Stability was a temporary illusion. As he left the room, he didn't feel shock. He felt confirmation. That conversation hadn't created conflict. It had merely revealed something that was already in motion. For the first time, this realization wasn't accompanied by paralyzing fear. He had options. That same week, the side project reached a symbolic milestone. The income generated with the help of artificial intelligence covered a significant portion of the family's monthly expenses. It didn't yet replace their salary, but it drastically reduced their dependence on it. The most important thing wasn't the amount, but the consistency. The system worked even when Ethan slowed down for a few days. That detail was crucial. The real climax happened one quiet night after putting their daughter to bed. Ethan and Laura sat at the kitchen table, no spreadsheets open, no rehearsed speeches. Just facts. They analyzed numbers, available time, stress levels, and financial reserves. They no longer discussed whether the extra income worked, but what to do with it. The decision wasn't to quit the job immediately. It was something more subtle and paradoxically more powerful. Ethan decided to formally reduce his working hours, accepting a less central role. This meant less fixed income, but also less stress, and more time to consolidate the project. It was a risky but calculated move. The company accepted without resistance. For Ethan, this was eye-opening. He realized the system wasn't fighting to keep him, just to keep the machine running. This clarity dissolved any remaining illusion of one-sided loyalty. The emotional climax intensified when the project faced its biggest test. A key client experienced an internal change and nearly cancelled the contract. The loss would have had a significant impact. Instead of panicking, Ethan acted strategically. He used AI to quickly analyze alternatives, adjust the proposal, and offer a solution more aligned with the client's new reality. The answer came within a few hours. The contract was maintained and expanded. This moment marked the visible transformation of the protagonist. There was no more desperate improvisation. There was mastery of the process. Ethan no longer depended on luck, but on conscious decisions supported by tools that multiplied his responsiveness. Meanwhile, Lucas Grant was experiencing his own narrative climax. He finally decided to organize everything he had observed and learned into an accessible, straightforward, and honest format. It didn't promise quick riches. It promised clarity. It showed how ordinary people with real limitations were using AI to create extra income from home. The impact was immediate, but different from what was expected. There was no viral explosion. There was depth. The people who arrived stayed. They applied. They adapted. The accounts began to accumulate, forming a clear mosaic of silent transformation. The climax of the story wasn't a single event, but a convergence. On one hand, Ethan consolidated his autonomy. On the other, Lucas made visible a movement that already existed, but lacked a clear narrative. The ultimate antagonism was clearly revealed. The belief that only traditional paths guarantee security. This belief was challenged not by ideological discourse, but by concrete facts. simple systems, recurring income, intelligent use of technology. The most symbolic moment came when Ethan realized that for the first time in years, he felt no fear when thinking about the future. Not because everything was guaranteed, but because he had developed the ability to adapt. Artificial intelligence was no longer a distant threat or an abstract promise. It was a tool integrated into his real life. The climax was drawing to a close without fireworks, without a dramatic job abandonment, without instant wealth, but with something more powerful, the reversal of the axis of dependence. The system no longer defined Ethan's limits on its own. He had created room for maneuver. This transformation was innovative precisely because it was accessible. It didn't require genius, large initial capital, or extreme sacrifices. It required practical vision, consistency, and a willingness to learn. At the height of the tension, the story resolved its central conflict. Ordinary people can indeed generate extra income with AI from home, not as an exception, but as a consequence of well-structured decisions. And that realization changed everything. Ethan's journey didn't conclude with a clearly marked finish line, but with the consolidation of a new reality. What was once a cautious attempt to supplement income had transformed into a functional system, integrated into daily life and sustained by conscious choices. Months after the turning point, Ethan's routine was different. Although outwardly it seemed ordinary, he still woke up early, still fulfilled professional and family commitments. The difference lay in control. Time had ceased to be merely something to be filled and had become something managed with intention. Each block of the day had a purpose, and each decision reflected a larger strategy. The extra income generated with the help of artificial intelligence wasn't constant in the rigid sense, but it was predictable enough to allow for planning. Some weeks yielded more, others less. This variation, once daunting, was now understood as a natural part of an independent system. Ethan had learned to deal with fluctuations without panic, adjusting his efforts and priorities as needed. In his traditional job, his more relaxed approach reduced stress and confirmed something he had long suspected. His identity wasn't tied to his position. He began to observe colleagues with empathy, understanding that many were not yet ready to question the model they lived in. There was no judgment, only an awareness that each person has their own time to awaken. At home, the impact was profound and lasting. Conversations about money lost their constant sense of urgency, not because all problems had disappeared, but because alternatives now existed. Laura felt like an active part of the process, not just a spectator of risks. The strengthened partnership was reflected in how they planned for the future, with more realism and less fear. The story's conclusion also revealed something bigger than Ethan's individual journey. Looking back, it became clear that his transformation didn't depend on a specific tool, but on how he came to approach learning and adaptation. Artificial intelligence was the catalyst, not the sole cause. It reduced barriers, accelerated processes, and allowed for rapid testing. But the decisive movement came from human action. Lucas Grant, observing the bigger picture, saw this pattern repeating itself countless times. Ordinary people didn't become technology experts. They became problem solvers. They used AI to augment capabilities, not to avoid effort. This distinction was crucial and explained why some advanced while others remained stagnant. The story concluded by showing that the real gain wasn't just financial, it was psychological. The reduction of chronic anxiety, the feeling of autonomy, and the realization that the future wasn't entirely out of control. These elements didn't appear in graphs, but they redefined quality of life. Ethan didn't consider himself an extraordinary success story. He hadn't given up everything or multiplied his income explosively. What he had done was more subtle and, perhaps for that reason, more powerful. He had created a structure parallel to traditional life, capable of growing, adapting, and withstanding external shocks. The long-term consequences were beginning to take shape. New ideas emerged more frequently because the fear of failure had diminished. Projects were evaluated using clear criteria, not out of desperation. Artificial intelligence had become part of everyday life, a natural extension of the ability to think and execute. In the bigger picture, the conclusion left a clear message consistent with the entire journey. The AI revolution doesn't just happen in large corporations or multi-million-dollar startups. It happens quietly in ordinary homes after the children go to sleep, when people decide to use technology practically to solve real problems. The world of the story hadn't changed drastically. The system remained imperfect. The risks persisted. But Ethan had changed his position within it. From a passive player, he had become an active agent. This change didn't guarantee eternal success, but it guaranteed something more valuable: adaptability. The conclusion didn't close off possibilities. It opened up new paths. It showed that learning, testing, and adjusting weren't temporary steps, but a way of life in a world shaped by technology. The extra income from AI wasn't the end of the journey, but the beginning of a new way of relating to work, time, and choices. In closing this chapter, the story made it clear that there was no absolute ending. There was continuity, and this continuity was built every day by ordinary people who decided not to wait for the future to be defined solely by external forces. Years later, looking back, Ethan didn't exactly remember the first value he gained from artificial intelligence. What remained vivid was the feeling of the moment when he realized he was no longer stuck on a single path. AI continued to evolve. Tools appeared and disappeared, but the mindset remained. He still worked, still learned, still adapted. In ordinary homes, in ordinary cities, other people silently repeated the same process, not as a fad, but as a practical response to a changing world. The revolution wasn't noisy, it was domestic. If this story made you see artificial intelligence in a different light, know that Ethan is not an exception. He represents ordinary people who decided to take action. Real change begins when you stop simply consuming technology and start using it strategically. Reflect. What tasks in your day could be optimized? What problems around you still lack simple solutions? Share your thoughts in the comments, exchange ideas with others, and take this conversation further. And if you want to continue exploring real, practical, and innovative stories about how to make money online using AI, subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for upcoming content.